Hello. Thank you so much for joining me and listening to my recorded presentation here. So, my name is Chris Bulock. I'm at Cal State University Northridge. I'm talking about OA discovery and delivery today. In particular, this is sort of an attempt to do a link checking study to look at the reliability of open access linking in a particular instance of Primo. And also taking a look at not just reliability, but some other factors about where linking is coming from and how different types of links are operating. Before I get started, I also want to give a big shout out to my CSU colleague Heather Cribbs at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. This study really builds on a larger study that she and I did together about link checking in the CSUN instance of Primo. And so none of this would have been possible, even though this particular study is one that I carried out on my own. So a big shout out to Heather. So the other thing I want to say as we get started here is that the intent of this is to talk about the method that I used and give some preliminary results. But those results are not really going to be generalizable to other institutions, in part just because there's so many different things that can go into the way that Primo is configured, that the link resolver knowledge base is working. There's just too many other factors for me to say that the types of results for OA linking that I saw are what someone else would see in their own instance of Primo. So it's more of how you might evaluate your own instance instead, or even working with a different discovery tool or setup. The main questions that I set out to answer in this study were, when somebody searches Primo at my institution, how many results are they going to see that are open access? In the central discovery index, there's a little flag for open access results, and some things can also get pulled from the catalog records too. The second question, do records that are marked as OA actually require authentication for full text linking? So part of this is trying to see whether somebody who wasn't affiliated with CSUN, if they could get into our instance of Primo and actually get to full text using OA links, or whether they still be presented with a login screen from our proxy server. And finally, do those links actually work? So how much of the time are those links failing? How reliable are they? So in order to set out to answer those questions, I basically thought I would do some searches in Primo and then look at the records that showed up and check some of the links. The first step was figuring out what I was going to be searching then. I wanted to use search strings that people had actually used, real life searches. So the easiest way for me to grab those was from the Primo popular searches subject area in Primo Analytics. Now, if you've ever looked at these, sometimes the results seem a little questionable. For example, there's one here, the second result here has like some HTML encoding. It seems very unlikely to me that really hundreds of people did this exact search. That said, there are definitely some things that seemed much more likely, and this still seemed like the best source I could get for real search strings people had used. I also get the number of search results that show up for these searches, at least a rough estimate. And the advantage of that is that I needed searches that were going to have a large number of results, so I could see how many were OA and narrow down a little bit just to OA articles. So something that only had 4 results wasn't going to work for me. So this helped do some screening for that. So I just picked 5 search terms from this. From there, I did kind of 2 separate searches for each of those terms. One was a search in our default scope in Primo, which just gives us things that are accessible to our patrons immediately. So things that are in our physical collections or that we have electronic access to directly. I looked at the first 25 results for each of those searches just to see how many of them showed up as open access. And then from there, I would switch over to a search scope that includes items from the Central Discovery Index, which is Primo's source of article information and book chapter information and other types of metadata too. But essentially, it's the metadata that publishers and other content providers are pushing out to Ex Libris for Primo. So I was looking at that and including things that we might not have full text access to. So that's the search scope that says all CSU libraries. So from there, I would narrow down just to open access and then just to articles. And from there, I was going to look at the top 10 results for each one, look at the records, and check on the links. So this shows an example of one record in our instance of Primo that met these criteria. And I'm just going to look at the different areas of the record where I was taking a look. So the first is where it says online access and full text availability here. This is where we have resolver links that are showing up. So each one will have kind of the resolver target or collection. And then these are all going to be full text links here generated by the Alma link resolver. Now, this shows a different type of full text linking. It shows up in the same area of the record, but this is a direct link. We call it like a Lincoln record type of link, or Lincoln record type of record too. So in Primo, we'll either see a record that relies on the resolver, or we'll see one that relies on this Lincoln record type of linking if there's any online full text. You can't do both. So if there is a Lincoln record type link like this, then we won't also see resolver links. In the previous study that I did with Heather Cribbs, we found that these Lincoln record types were much more reliable. It's essentially just a link that is hard-coded into that CDI record rather than an open URL that's being generated on the fly using the record metadata. So it's understandable that it's more reliable because it's an actual stable link rather than something that's being created based on metadata that might not exactly match up to the target. And then the final area I was looking at, I'm just calling additional links here. So these are sometimes coming from publishers, but we also see things that are coming from sources like Unpaywall, because we have a plugin active here where it checks if there's any DOI in the record. And if that DOI matches against Unpaywall's data for open access articles, then it'll display that here as well. So we'll see kind of different types of links that will show up here. Most of them will, like this, either say PDF or read online, which is going to be usually an HTML version of the full text. And then from there, we also see records like this one, where there's not actually anything in that online full text area of the record, but we still see an additional link. So this is a case where there is neither a link resolver link nor a direct link that was hard-coded into the CDI record. But I believe in this case, through that Unpaywall plugin, it was still able to identify a matching PDF for full text. And so even though Primo's little method of determining whether something is full text or not means that it wouldn't show this one as full text, but we're still able to deliver a full text PDF in this case. So I wanted to make sure I was including these in our testing so I could see how often the situation was coming up. So then I got to work searching and checking links. And this is a view of the spreadsheet that I was tracking things in, where once I got to the link checking part of it, there would be an entry for each article, each search result. And then I would just count how many different types of full text links were showing up and track whether they worked or not. And how many of them didn't require authentication. So here's an example of one of those records. This shows, we had 4 resolver links in this case. And just the first 2 were Elsevier links, and those require authentication. They're going through the proxy server. The second 2 are going to be unauthenticated links that just go to an open access version. And so this is a record that was flagged as open access, but half the links still required authentication. Then we have that additional link up at the top, that read online one. So I want to start to dive into the search results. And the first part was just, when I looked at each search, I counted how many among the first 25 results were open access. So that means I was looking at a total of 125 search results, but only 4% of them were open access. So if we're just doing a search in our default scope, and it's a really broad search term, maybe 2 or 3 words, something like Black Los Angeles or healthcare administration were examples of ones that I used. If we don't limit at all, then really a very small percentage of results were open access. Now, this one was maybe my most disappointing finding of this study. As I mentioned earlier, we found that the Lincoln record types of links were much more reliable than resolver links in a previous study. So I was hoping that, particularly with open access records, we would see a lot of link and record types of links, because there are publishers that provide metadata to Primo of just all of our open access content, and those often are link and record type collections of metadata. We also see like the DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, that provides metadata in this format. It's open access makes a lot of sense for a link and record type approach because we can just hard code a link in there that'll work for every user of Primo, and we don't need to worry about matching against entitlements or the proxy server or anything like that. But I looked at a total of 50 records here, just 10 for each of my 5 search terms, and only one of them was a link and record type record. So that means that instead, most of them were relying on the resolver, which is just, I found before, it tends to be more unreliable. The other thing I was interested in were how many records didn't have any full text links in them. So nothing from the resolver, nothing that were link and record. And the answer was just 3. I thought it was sort of interesting that there were any, because of course these were records that were flagged as open access, but they still didn't have anything that was showing up as like a full text link. The caveat to that, though, is there actually was an additional link for all 3 of these. So unpaywall data was still able to provide a link here for 3 out of the 50 cases where we didn't see other types of full text links. So from here, I'm going to dig into the resolver links, which made up obviously the majority here. So 46 out of the 50 records were relying on link resolvers, the Alma link resolver, to provide full text data. So we had 110 resolver links, which means we were seeing more than 2 resolver links for most of the records in these cases. And about a quarter of them were open access. So even on all of these records that were flagged as OA, the majority of the links, 75% of them, still required authentication. So what I'm seeing here is that it's not going to be a great way to provide full text access to someone who's not affiliated with CSUN, for example, because most of the links they'll find are going to require them to log in. We saw that 25 of those 28 OA links worked. So something like 10% did not actually get to full text. Now, the additional links, the ones that show up at the top of the record, were a little different. So we saw 75 of these. I believe I saw these on every single record. There is one showing up even in those cases where there wasn't a resolver or direct link. And out of these, more like half of them did not require authentication. Part of that is because we had that unpaywall plugin. And so we were seeing more that were unauthenticated that did not require a proxy login. And of these, 36 of the 37 worked. So we saw, it's a very small data set, so I'm not going to jump to any conclusions here, but we did see a lower error rate, just one that didn't work here. So I was pretty pleased with my little preliminary results. I might want to expand this later, but I was able to answer some questions here. So when we search Primo, how many results are OA? Really just only a handful when we're doing a broad, unlimited search like this. Second, do records that are marked OA actually require authentication for full text access? And yes, more than half of the links in OA records are still requiring people to log in. Then finally, do the unauthenticated OA links actually work? Mostly, yes. It could definitely be better. I'm not really pleased with the 10% error rate for the resolver links. I would love to see more of the link and record type links. But this is the conclusion of my presentation. I'd be happy to address any questions by email later on, but thank you for sticking around and for joining me for this.